Hey everybody, Mr. Noble here with a quick run through on the Frankenstein Lecture slides. This has been a crazy week. I had hoped to go through this with you live, but unfortunately it had to get recorded. I will go over this information next week as well, but I wanted to make sure you had something to work with this weekend as you start the book. I've split this into four different sections. We're going to talk about the author, the influence, the publication, and then some text features you need to know in order to understand this book. This is kind of a preview of these ideas, and then we'll keep coming back to them as we work our way through the novel. So, the first thing we've got here is the author. Mary Shelley is a very interesting person for a few different reasons. Um, she's born in 1797, and I think the first thing we really need to know about her is that she's the daughter of two of England's leading intellectuals who are also considered to be quite radical. So we would think of them as educated kind of academics, and they're radical in their ideologies as far as how they believe things should operate for the most part, especially during this time. So we would consider them to be kind of liberal under our standards today. It's also interesting to note that she was 19 years old when this book came out. Um, Even in a time like this, when people don't live as long as they do today, to be a young woman of 19 and publish something like this is a pretty big deal. And we'll talk about that here in a minute as well. You also should think about the idea that Mary Shelley's mother is Mary Wollstonecraft, who is a extremely famous writer in her own right, and especially concerning women's rights. She writes a document, a novel, book, whatever you want to call it, um, in 1797 called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is a document that sets out this idea that women are just as capable as men and should be given the same rights. If it is not for Mary Wollstonecraft, the suffrage movement in England and then later in the United States would probably never have taken shape in the same way. Her document is cited all the way through the 1920s here in America when the Voting Rights Act is passed and women get the right to vote. So Mary Wollstonecraft is a huge, huge figure in the rights of women still today. It's also interesting that Mary Wollstonecraft, dies 11 days after giving birth to Mary Shelley, which means that Mary grows up in a world without her own mother. This is something that we'll see throughout the book. Is this idea of the mother and what is the mother's responsibility and what do you do when your mother's not there? So keep track of that as we go through. And then her father, William Godwin, is also a very famous writer, philosopher of his own, and he's very concerned with this revolutionary idea of the time known as rights of the individual. So, in the French and American Revolution, there is this idea that no longer can a king tell us what to do, but we have power over ourselves and we make our own way. Manifest Destiny in America is a huge version of this rights of the individual. It's about no longer being told what to do and having your own power, being your own master, basically. And so look out for this revolutionary idea that people can take care of themselves as we go through this book. Another interesting person in Mary Shelley's life is a man named Percy. He is her future husband um, and lover, editor. He has a big role in everything that she does here. Um, and first off, he himself is an extremely famous poet during the Romantic period. And before he is joined up here with Mary Shelley, he spends a lot of time in her home hanging out with her dad. He spends time reciting his poetry. And so, from a fairly young age, Percy Shelley is a part of Mary's household. And then, when she turns 16, she ends up running away to France with Percy Shelley, where they um, declare that they are going to eventually get married to each other. Mary ends up getting pregnant before they are married. The problem is Percy Shelley's got a wife, he has a kid, and she's pregnant. So this is not necessarily the best situation for everyone. Um, while Mary's parents are very open-minded about things, they're not okay with their 16-year-old daughter running away with a married man. And so that doesn't go very well for her. Um, and then when Percy's wife dies, a little while later, Percy and Mary are able to get married. Sadly, she gives birth to four children in 5 years' time, and three of them die as infants. So, right off the bat, Mary's lost her mother, and then she loses several of her children. They die to things like malaria and dysentery, things that we can now control with science, but back in the day, there was not a whole lot they could do. And then after the publication of the book, a few years later, Percy ends up dying in a boating accident. He drowns. Um, so she is a woman who has a lot of terrible things happen to her over not a very long amount of time. And so tragedy is also something that defines Mary Shelley. So we go through the book. That will be it'll be very obvious that she's had some bad times. Here's a look at the timeline. 1797 to 1818 is not very long for all of the things that have gone on in Mary's life. Um, we'll come back to this, but no, it's crazy time. A lot of crazy things happening. Less than 20 years. Okay, so when we look at inspiration, right? Why did she write this book? What's going on in her head? We'll spend some time talking about this as we go through. But the first big thing is the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Um, it's interesting to note that she, like Percy Shelley, Samuel Taylor Coleridge would also show up at her house. And so there are diary letter entries from Mary in which she describes listening to Coleridge recite Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner in her house, which is a pretty big deal to have that man um, and that work inside of your house. So that's something that was impactful upon her. Reminder that the mariner tries to play God, right? This idea of playing God or messing with nature is big in this story here and in the book we're about to read. And then he kills the albatross, right, which is his act of defiance against God. The albatross was a good sign, and he blows it out of the sky, and everything falls apart. But instead of dying himself, he must repent for this terrible thing. And so he must wander the earth for his days, trying to tell everybody, hey, don't do bad things. Here's what I learned, right? Which is the purpose of this piece, right? To warn people about going too far. And then we also remember that there is a frame narrative running this piece, just like in Frankenstein. The next thing that we looked at was the Prometheus myth. Um, Reminder that Prometheus is a Greek titan. He's considered to be a trickster. He is also a intellectual, and then he is the god of fire. And there's quite a bit we can read into as far as symbolism there, with fire, light. Um, we'll get back to that, but think about that. Why fire? What is fire? What does it represent? In the myth, he creates humans out of clay, and then he gives them the fire that he has stolen from the gods. He has defied them. He has done this terrible thing to try and create and sustain life. And then he ends up getting punished by Zeus. He is tied to a rock where he will have a bird come and eat out his liver every single day, and then it will regrow. And for eternity, he will constantly have to bear this burden for what he has done. But he's done these actions on behalf of humanity. Um, so there's this idea about defying God and the natural order of things, but can it be justified? And it's interesting to note she subtitles this book "The Modern Prometheus." So she is trying to tell everyone who picks this book up and opens it up, don't forget about Prometheus. And we'll come back to that. The third thing that we need to know before we get into this book is a poem book by John Milton called Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is a 10,000 line poem in blank verse, which means it does not rhyme, but it is a few hundred pages of poetry telling a very elaborate story, which at its base is about Adam and Eve. There are a lot of angels and demons. It's about defying God, not trusting in God, doing what you think is best, and then having bad things happen to you. There's a lot of talk about the devil coming in and influencing you. So really, it is a huge poem about the battle for good and evil. There's a lot of religion in there, but you need to know that it's Adam and Eve, original sin, good, evil, and then the choices that we make and how that relates to what happens to us. So Paradise Lost will also be quoted in the book we're about to read and will come up quite often. And then, as I said earlier, in history itself, there are some serious revolutions happening. The American Revolution, 1765 to 1783. I would argue for the next 30 years, there's still quite a bit of revolution and struggle happening there. So even as this book is coming out, America has not completely broken free from where they were before. The French Revolution follows 1789 to 1799. Basically the same thing. They are overthrowing their king. The people want their own destiny. They're not going to have a king tell them what to do anymore. And another revolution in a different way is the Industrial Revolution. So during this time, we are changing basically the framework of society, how we do things, how we make money, how we live. So the whole world is changing in quite drastic terms, but it's a lot about having control over what we're doing and our own destiny and making our own goods and running our own governments. So there's a lot of individualism that's coming out of this here. As far as the publication, we'll talk about this as we go. This story is an interesting one. Lake Geneva in Switzerland, summer of 1815. The short of it is that Mary and Percy, a man named Lord Byron, who was an extremely famous romantic poet, again, a woman named Claire, who was Mary's stepsister, who's having an affair with Byron, and she's pregnant with his child, but he's married, so a lot of that. And then a man named John Polidori, who is a writer, but mostly a doctor. They go on a vacation because they're rich people and they have nothing to do, so they go to Switzerland. The weather is very terrible. They're stuck inside, right? So, like living in Tillamook. And then they start having these conversations about something called galvanism, which is this idea that you can bring things back to life. Back in the day, they were starting to experiment with electricity and shooting electricity into dead animals, basically. And they noticed when they put a frog up to some electricity, that the muscles would move, the frog would flop around. And so there was this idea that, well, maybe we could use electricity to bring things back to life. We know now that that was just a muscle spasm due to the electrical current, but back in the day, they thought, hey, we could plug these people in and we could turn them back on. And so there is this huge idea about galvanism. These people are sitting around, hanging out. They're all famous writers, intellectuals, and they decide to have a story competition in which they will all write spooky stories, try to scare each other. From this competition, Mary Shelley comes up with the story known as what will become Frankenstein. And then Polidori comes up with something called The Vampire, which is widely believed to be what Bram Stoker, several years later, will use to write Dracula. So this story is born out of a short story competition between her husband, and some of her friends. And then that gets turned into Frankenstein. We'll come back to this story as we go through. Um, Another interesting thing about this book, move this over here, is that due to the times, 19th century England, the book is published anonymously. So Mary Shelley's name does not appear on this book until 3 years after its first publication. There was a mention of William Godwin in the introduction of the book, and so people kind of assumed that Percy Shelley had written it, her husband, but not until 1821 does she get her name on the book. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we'll talk about that. But a woman trying to produce a novel, especially a kind of fantastical one like this, did not go over well. And so she does not get to put her name on her own book. Initially, it receives mixed reviews because it's kind of strange, especially for the time. But it becomes more famous as time goes on. And then the Frankenstein we know today comes out of 1931. There's a very famous movie with Boris Karloff, and that's the Frankenstein that we know today. Okay, now some text features. So we're almost done. As you are looking at the book itself, the title is Frankenstein. The subtitle, which is meant to give extra information to the reader, is The Modern Prometheus. So keep that in mind. There is an epigram on the first edition of this book, which is a quote. So the author is trying to say, hey, before you start reading my book, here's a quote to get you thinking. Notice that comes from Paradise Lost. Originally, it was split into 3 volumes, which is like sections. But now we look at 23 chapters, usually split up into those same 3 parts. And then it was originally published in London, 1818. Romanticism is a big part of this. We'll get into this later, but please know that Romanticism is all about emotions, it's all about the individual, and it's all about nature. So how do we feel about what we're seeing? How do we feel about these beautiful streams and trees and mountains? And then at the end of the day, I'm an individual and I can make my own destiny. Another thing comes up called Gothic literature. So this book is often considered to be a work of Gothic literature, which is another word for horror and suspense, especially back in the day. Originally, it was described as containing a pleasing amount of terror. I would say this is something called catharsis, which is when you feel better, you release emotions by going through or watching something. So people like to watch scary movies because you build up all of this tension and all of this worry about what's going to happen. And then when everybody's okay in the end, you release emotions, this catharsis, and you feel better. And so that's kind of what this is intended to be in its original form. And then later on, this Gothic literature becomes what we call science fiction today. Back in the day, there wasn't a whole lot of science, just a lot of fiction. And then as we start to learn stuff about science, that gets influenced in the books, and then we create our own genre known as science fiction. Um, because of that, we widely consider Frankenstein to be the first science fiction novel. Reminder, this is going to be a frame narrative. The first 4 letters that you shall read here this weekend are um, the frame of the story that's about to come. So make sure you keep track of what's going on. Notice the narrator will switch as we go through these different frames, and things will start to get more complex as the story builds. Another reminder to look out for foil characters, which is when a character is really there just to help us learn more about the main character. So there are a few people in this book who are there to help us understand more about Victor Frankenstein, the protagonist. So think about who are these subtle characters along the side and what are they trying to show me about the main characters. A term called epistolary will come up, especially in the frame. That is when a story is made up out of letters. So think Diary of a Wimpy Kid, the book Perks of Being a Wallflower. It's when the author uses letters, diary entries, whatever it is, to try and tell a story that way. So you will see letters, and that is the author trying to tell us a story with these letters. Here is some pictures of the settings we're going to encounter. Notice that they're all very naturey. They're pretty, they're blue, there's water, there's ice. And so a lot of this book will take place outside in the grandeur of nature, which is a very important romantic idea. Nature is pretty, we should go honor it. And so you'll see a lot of nature in this book. Is book takes place in the 1700s as well, and then it's widely believed to take place over 9 months, which should put something in your head. What takes 9 months? So here are our characters. One thing that kind of stands out about this book is Frankenstein is not this dude over here. This is not Frankenstein. Frankenstein is actually the creator of the monster, and unfortunately, the poor monster doesn't get a name. We call him the creature or the monster, and we'll talk about why that is later on. Victor Frankenstein is the mad scientist who creates the thing, and this is the battle: Victor Frankenstein and the creature. So these are our two main characters. Robert Walton is a important side character. He's part of the frame, and then Elizabeth Lavenza will have quite a role in this book as well. So here we are. We've made it through. What did you learn? There was a lot of information. We'll go through this as the book progresses, but please keep all of these things in mind as we start reading. So your assignment is to read the letters, the first 14 pages of the book, and then answer these 6 questions. We will discuss them in class on the Monday, Tuesday call, and then we will work forward in the book. I hope this helped you get a better idea of what's going on. I know this was a whole lot of information, but we will come back to this stuff as we go. The last thing I have here on this last slide is a little video for some further reading. If you're interested, talks about some science behind what happened in the book. But Mary Shelley, this whole time period is really interesting and different. And so I know I've overloaded you with some context, but without all of this information, this is just a weird book. You're going to notice the language is old, the style is different. So these first few chapters kind of just roll with it. And then hopefully as you get into the book, you kind of get used to what's going on, the language, the frame, the characters. And then we can try and figure out what Mary Shelley's really trying to do. So please get some reading done and good luck to you. Thanks for listening. Let me know what I can do to help.